Hey there, good evening. Welcome back to I Care for Your Brain with Dr. Karen Sullivan. That is moi. I am very happy to be back with you here tonight. We try to meet every Wednesday for about a half hour of brain health, education, and empowerment, and I absolutely love it. And thank you all so much for loving it as well. We are getting close to 9,000 learners with us here, and I have to start by bragging about our first lecture in Brain School that happened last week. We had an absolutely awesome time together. If you were there, give me a shout out and let me know. We went for over 2 hours. It was kind of like a super dense, pretty high level academic lecture that hopefully is delivered in a way that's easily understandable. We talked all about brain health, what's normal as you get older, what you have to watch out for, when you might want to advocate for a gold standard evaluation. We talked all about the elements of a gold standard evaluation. We spent a lot of time talking about the concept of dementia. What exactly does that mean? What are the modifiable risk factors and the non-modifiable risk factors? And folks just really seem to love it from the feedback that we've gotten. So it's been starting off to be a great journey. And we are going to get started with lecture number 2 on May 13th. And this topic is really interesting, especially if you have grandkids or kids and you want them to understand to not put off worrying about brain health until you're older, right? We want people of all developmental stages to be concerned with brain health, because after all, we're all only one moment away from having a brain health challenge, and folks should be prioritizing brain health always. So we're actually going to go through like embryonic to infantile to childhood to young adulthood, medium adulthood, older adulthood, and talk about what are the top risk factors at those ages that come home to roost in your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when you really are very much focused on brain health. So I really loved it. It's gonna at least be 90 minutes each time, if not 2 hours. 68-page workbook is mailed to you before. You get the replay so you can watch it anytime, all for less than a typical copay in the US. So we'll post a link to that in the comments here. So what we try to do on these brain health lectures is you all send me a topic that you think is interesting. Sometimes something comes into my life, pops into my head from my clinical work with my patients. And this week's topic was a more personal one. I got some lab work back from the primary care doctor, and they told me that I was low in vitamin D. Now, of course, I know generally about vitamin D, and I know many patients come to me with that in their charts. And I thought, you know what? I don't understand really enough about that. And so let me do a deep dive. And once I do that, I feel like I want to share that information with everybody here. So vitamin D is super interesting for a few reasons, and it really impacts the brain health community. So the goal of this lecture is I want you to ultimately advocate to get your vitamin D checked if you have not done so, because I do believe it is one of those modifiable risk factors for brain health problems. So modifiable means you can modify it. There's something you can do about it. So vitamin D is actually not a vitamin at all. It is a fat-soluble neurosteroid hormone that regulates neurotransmitters and neurotrophins. That is way too much for me to wrap my head around. Okay, so I don't like jargon. I try not to speak in jargony, doctory neuro terms, because I don't need to prove I'm smart and I don't need to alienate you as my listener. So what we're gonna do is let's go through each of those terms to just talk about it in real language. So fat soluble just means your body can store it for months. So vitamin D isn't necessarily something that you need to take every single day. Okay, neurosteroid, what that means is it's a steroid that can either come through food, a pill, sunlight, or it can be something that your brain makes on its own. So it's synthesized within the brain, and it is then able to modulate the firing of brain cells, so excitability of brain cells. And we all want our brain cells to be firing pretty darn rapidly. Neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that allow brain cells to communicate back and forth. But what we really care about when we talk about vitamin D is neurotrophins. This is the backbone of neuroplasticity. Neurotrophins are a class of growth factor molecules that are in the brain. They secrete proteins that can give instructions to particular cells that tell them whether to survive, to grow, to rebuild. This is the neuroplasticity that so many of you in the brain health community are striving for. Of course, this is critical to brain health. So to be a vitamin, it has to be something the body cannot make on its own. Body cannot come up with vitamin C, cannot make vitamin B on its own. But sure enough, in the skin, we do actually produce vitamin D. It also functions as an anti-inflammatory, generally speaking, and an antioxidant. But here's what's gone wrong with vitamin D. We've been very successful in the fight against skin cancer and having people really prioritize the use of sunscreen. However, there's some unintended consequences there, and that is kind of what they're calling this worldwide pandemic of sorts of low vitamin D. So chances are you or someone you know has had an experience with this deficiency. So according to a study about 10 years ago, about 42% of adults in the US would be considered vitamin D deficient. That number goes up the browner your skin is. So if you are Hispanic, you have a 70% chance of being deficient. If you are African American, you are 82% more likely to have a vitamin D deficiency. I mean, that's like 3 in 4. 3 in 4 people have that concern. Now that's pretty significant. We mostly think of vitamin D as it's related to bone health, right? And a lot of us know that vitamin D has to be joined with calcium in order to maintain the phosphorus that we need in the blood to maintain healthy, strong bones. So in adults, a lot of us know if you don't have enough vitamin D, it's been associated with things like rickets, osteomalacia, which is where you get a softening of your bones, osteoporosis, where the bones become weak and brittle. But you probably don't know how it feeds into other systems like your cardiovascular system or your nervous system, which includes our BFF, the brain, that we care about so much here. So vitamin D can get into the brain by crossing the blood-brain barrier through passive diffusion. Now, the blood-brain barrier is one of my favorite parts of the brain because it's just so well designed through all the time of evolution and natural selection, but it's critical for keeping us healthy. But we also sometimes have to learn to bypass it to get molecules in the brain, things like chemotherapy for brain cancer. So I've studied it quite a bit. It's a very selective, semi-permeable barrier. So I always think about it like a very tight weave on a fabric. Basically, it's a gatekeeper or a security guard that protects against bad things coming in, like toxins that might cause your brain an infection, but it also has to allow certain nutrients to get into the brain. So once the vitamin D molecules get in, which the gatekeepers say, yes, you are healthy, you will help me, so you are allowed in, these molecules then bind to vitamin D receptors that we have in the brain, and they're all over the brain, but they are in highest abundance in places where we make new memories, called the hippocampus, in a part of the frontal cortex called the orbital frontal cortex, and this is where we do a lot of decision making, weighing the pros and cons. It is in a part of the brain in high levels called the cingulate, which is related to emotions, the amygdala, which is our threat detector, and the thalamus, which is our relay station. So for all my folks with stroke, listen to those parts of the brain, because I think the vitamin D issue should be really on your radar if you've had a thalamic stroke, if you've had any kind of a stroke that affects the subcortical system, anything related to the hippocampus. There's been a long line of controversial research associating vitamin D levels with brain structure and brain function. So what I'm going to give you tonight is just like the bottom line, right? Like the snippet. So I probably spent about maybe 3 or 4 hours this week going through research articles, doing a decent literature search on vitamin D in the brain to only come up with this idea like, they're not 100% sure. But even when I can't give you clear guidance, I still want you to understand what are the positives and negatives that brain scientists are talking about. So the first thing they typically do when studying anything in the brain is they study it in the rodent model, mice and rats, because they can do all sorts of things with those animals. They actually can breed them to have knockout genes, meaning they can breed these animals and take away all of their vitamin D receptors. So their brains are literally getting 0 vitamin D. So when you do that, what happens to these animals is they have really hard time with memory, which makes sense, right? They're nervous wrecks. Their behavior is very, very neurotic, and they have a reduction in nerve growth factor. And that's the piece that is really weighing on me as it relates to you all in my brain health community. Once they switch over to the human studies, things get a lot more complicated. So the first reports that came out just said there is an association between low vitamin D and cognitive impairment. They were linking it up. Is this maybe even the cause of Alzheimer's? Because in the people that got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, they tended to have low D. However, a group of scientists, I think rightfully came out a few years later and said, you know what, just because this is associated doesn't mean we have an if-then situation here, right? So basically, what if it was reversed? What if the low D didn't cause the cognitive impairment, but people who have cognitive impairment are doing less physical activity, so they're outside less? Maybe they just in general don't prioritize their health. So instead of being a cause, maybe it's just an association and we don't really understand it. So this led into like a very active 2-decade period with vitamin D where they did meta-analysis, cross-sectional studies, case control studies, prospective studies. And basically where we're at is there is an association between low vitamin D, cognitive impairment, and dementia. We're just not exactly sure of the direction. We do know, though, there's a few areas of cognition, different types of thinking, cognitive domains, cognitive areas, that is most affected, and this is processing speed and executive function, specifically multitasking. So if you've got those problems, let's get your vitamin D optimized. I think it would be a little naive to say it's going to be a miracle cure, but the way I work as a neuropsychologist is we care about all the contributing factors. We don't want to just say, well, the person's had a stroke, let's just watch their recovery reveal itself. We want to take away any additional barrier that is on top of the stroke syndrome that is interfering with something like processing speed or multitasking. So I would say it's relatively unclear at this point, but I do think there is one piece of literature that's very clear. If you look at folks that already have cognitive impairment, when you supplement them with vitamin D to adequate levels, I think it's pretty clear that they do have a slower cognitive decline. So I know many of you who are listening to me have brain health challenges that cognitive impairment, even if it's very mild, are a part of the constellation of your symptoms. So I wanted to get vitamin D on your radar because I think it's just a really important thing to monitor. And, there's a lot of controversy about what constitutes a low enough level, how much should you supplement, and we're going to get into that in a few minutes. But there's some doctors who might say, hey, if we check it once, every 2 years, you should be good. So as always, I want to empower you with top of the line information so you can go in there and be like, let me just give you a little info here about, what I've learned about vitamin D and brain health, and that's really important to me, so I'd like to check it again, One of the things they started to look at then was, again, if you supplement with good over-the-counter, vitamin D, what happens? Do people's cognitions get better? Are they less likely to develop dementia? So what was cool about this study I want to tell you about, these are 2 European studies that came out of the University of Cambridge and another university in England. And they looked at folks over the age of 65, but instead of just saying people were deficient in vitamin D before or they were, optimum, just making it real black or white, not good or good, they did a really cool thing where they started to look at borderline deficient, insufficient, pretty good, and great. And this is a very cool trend, I think, in medicine where we're actually starting to respect borderline impaired results. And this has come about in the thyroid treatment world more than anywhere. So there's a huge push now not to just treat people who have absolutely impaired thyroid values, but people who are kind of in that borderline zone if they're symptomatic. So that's really the change that happened in the vitamin D world just a couple of years ago, really. And that's kind of what happened to me is the doctor said, technically your levels aren't low, but I certainly don't think they're optimal. So why don't we talk about getting your levels up? And that's when I was curious to kind of do this looking into. So what they basically found is, sure enough, people who had the optimum D level, so higher on the normal end, were in the lowest quartile and were more than twice as likely to not be cognitively impaired. Okay, the second group also looked at the people on the borderline impaired level and found that they were much more likely to have low processing speed. And this effect was particularly strong for men over the age of 60. So if you are a man who's maybe had a stroke and you're over the age of 60, ding, 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 the research is saying we really should prioritize this in you. How do we get vitamin D into our body? Ultraviolet radiation is the major source of vitamin D. It's pretty amazing what happens when our skin is exposed to sunlight. There is no universal worldwide consensus about the cutoff value for vitamin D, but what they typically do is measure you. They think anything under 30 is typically impaired or insufficient, and you can go all the way up to 50. Now, of course, depending on what part of the world you're in, we're going to have different measurements. Symptoms of vitamin D deficiency are pretty diffuse. There's nothing that's very specific here, and you can have these issues for, 10,000 other reasons, but they are fatigue, bone and back pain, muscle pain, poor mood, wounds that don't heal very quick, and hair loss. If the deficiency goes on for too long, you can really get some significant complications like weak bones that crack when you don't even, I've had patients that break a leg when they are putting on pants in the morning and just put their leg back down on the floor. Cardiovascular conditions, autoimmune issues, infections, certain kinds of cancer, breast, prostate, colon. But what I really would love you all to think about is that worsening cognitive health is also one of the long-term ramifications, consequences of not treating your vitamin D. So there's 3 ways to get your vitamin D: sunlight, food, and supplements. So let's go through all 3 of those. Getting sufficient sunlight is your best way to help your body produce enough vitamin D. Now, this can be hard depending on where you live and your skin color and your risk for skin cancer, okay? So these things depend on like your geographical location, where you are in relationship to the equator. It's not as easy as just go outside, okay? When the sun's rays hit us, we have a process of photosynthesis that happens in our skin, which then initiates all sorts of complicated processes inside our tissues that start making vitamin D. You don't need to get a tan, you don't need to get a sunburn in order to get enough vitamin D. The body will make all the vitamin D that it needs for a day in about half the time it takes your skin to burn. So again, remember I said time of day. So you're gonna get more vitamin D when you're in the sun during the middle of the day, because that's the time when the sun is at the highest peak in the sky. Of course, if you are in the sun for long periods of time, you absolutely want to prioritize sunscreen. It's not as easy as we'll go out without sunscreen. The more skin you have exposed, the more likely you are to make that vitamin D that you need. So exposing, when I go out for a walk in the afternoon, when I'm done seeing patients, I try to wear a shirt that has no sleeves and I wear a hat because I don't want sun on my face. I am spending much too much money on moisturizer to go out there and get my face in there. So just like exposing my shoulders will allow me to get more vitamin D than if I did just let my hands and my face be exposed. So I would say wearing a hat is important, but also, for 15-20 minutes, let your arms be exposed. The paler you are, the more vitamin D you're going to make in a shorter amount of time. So again, if you have a browner skin, you're going to probably need to be out there a little bit longer. So they say about 15 minutes for folks with light skin and a couple of hours for folks with darker skin, which is really quite the difference. So it's a perfect example of one size all information does not fit everyone. If you wear a sunscreen that has an SPF as low as 8, that is going to reduce your body's ability to absorb vitamin D by 95%. Holy smokes, no wonder we've got an epidemic of D deficiency. The other way you can get D is in food. So in the 1920s, 1930s in America, they started to add fortified vitamin D to milk in an effort to eradicate rickets, one of those soft bone type issues. There are multiple food sources of vitamin D. It's just a lot harder for your body to absorb it, but things like salmon, mackerel, tuna, egg yolks, cheese, beef liver, mushrooms, that fortified milk. So 1 8-ounce serving of milk has about 25% of your daily value of vitamin D. And they do put it in cereals, juices, things like this. But here's a question. How much vitamin D do I need in any given day? Well, guess what? Very controversial. Once again, we have recommended values, but it's such an individual thing. I would really much prefer you to get that value from your doctor. Children are recommended at the lowest dose, about 600 international units. And once you get over age 70, they want you to go up to about 800, okay? During pregnancy and breastfeeding, you're also gonna need a little bit more. That's if you test normal, just as a way to kind of keep it stable. If you're low, what they're going to recommend is typically a 4-week course of once a week doing like 50,000 IUs, international units, in order to get those levels up, okay? But again, very personalized thing. I'm definitely not giving you personalized medical advice here. I want you to work through that with your own doctor. But remember, we want to focus on insufficiency and borderline results nowadays. We don't want to just accept if we're not at the perfect optimal stage that we're okay, right? So this is, the more you know, right? So you can go and advocate. What I would say is if vitamin D is important to your health, if you are in any of the groups that I've mentioned before, if you are somebody who has started to go through menopause, if you've ever been diagnosed with a bone health issue, if you've ever had gastric bypass, if you have any kind of like celiac issue, if you wear skin coverings, and are less able to absorb sunlight for, religious purposes, if you have dark skin, you want this to be a priority. And really, you could get it done every 3 to 6 months. It takes about 3 months after supplementation to actually see a difference in your blood value. So typically what they do is they measure it's called hydroxyvitamin D25. And typically between 20 and 40 is considered normal. I think my value, I was gonna tell you guys, I was the 32, and in my doctor's office, they thought 30 to 79 was normal. So it goes by what lab test they pick. And so, 30 would have been the cutoff, but I was at 32.1. So she said, it's just a little low. So, and I go in there being like, I'm tired all the time, and they're like, well, you're working yourself, and, you got 2 kids. And so, these issues aren't always the complete explanation, but my goodness, if you've got another thing dragging you down, it's just going to be hard to get that quality of life that we all deserve. I want you to think about this though, with any kind of vitamin or supplement. Let's try to get that out of our head that more is better. There are real risks with over-the-counter medications. There's real risks of toxicity. The goal is not high vitamin D. We just want a nice, stable, solid number, okay? So I want you to prioritize this part of your brain health conversations when you go in to see your neurologist, when you go in to see your primary care doc. So one thing I'm very clear about after my research is low D is a concern to you all in my community, specifically due to the lessening of the nerve growth factors in the brain. This is the biggest mover and shaker in the world of plasticity, and all of you who listen to me, either the stroke community, essential tremor, orthostatic tremor, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, even things, I just had a patient today with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder from military service, and we were talking a lot about how that's really a chronic condition, just like a lot of other neurological conditions and chronic depression. These things are all brain-based, and so we don't want to put them in a box and just say, well, that's mental health. Mental health is brain health, right? So if you resonated with any of the risk factors today, please be an advocate for yourself and get it in the conversation. We are starting to sign up for Lecture 2 of Brain School. We're going to focus on, again, like I said before, going through really important decades in life to talk about what should you be doing at that age to protect your brain from all the subtypes of dementia. We'll have a link to that in the comments section. This lecture, what's funny? I didn't think it would get a lot of interest. I don't know why. I just thought, are that many people interested in vitamin D? But this is one of the bigger crowds we've ever had. So I just love that you all are taking this part of your brain health seriously. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really enjoy and value this time together. Those of you who came to Brain School, thank you so much for letting me be your trusted guide on your brain health journey. It really was a blast. I loved the nice Q&A section that we had at the end where I was able to answer so many of your personal questions. So I hope you guys will join us then, May 13th. And until then, take care. I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.